Welcome back to Bammerhab, Season 4, Episode 8. Bammerhab is a podcast about one writer's attempt to dig deeper into God's Word by exploring the Greek and Hebrew words inside it. I am SDG Morgan, and I'll be your tour guide around this dig. Today's episode is another interview, this time with author and podcaster Chase Replogle, who chose the Greek phrase scandalon, and it's from Luke 17:1, which is, Jesus said to his disciples, "Things that cause people to stumble are bound to come, but woe to anyone through whom they come." The Greek word scandalon, or in this passage the plural is actually used, scandala, is clearly the root for the English word scandal. But in Greek, it is actually a little more complex. The literal meaning in Greek is a word for a tripwire, to a trap stick, and therefore metaphorically it means an offense or a stumbling block. In Matthew 13:41, Jesus promised that one day he would send his angels to gather up all the traps, the scandala, and cast them out of his kingdom. But before that point, scandala are one of the few things that Jesus guarantees. He doesn't say if, but when you are offended in Luke 17:1. In the NIV translation of Luke 17:1, Jesus says that offenses are bound to come. There's no way to not be offended. It will happen. We can't control that part. All we can control is how we respond to that inevitable offense. Satan has ensured there will be a trap of offense out there with our name on it. And Jesus calls this trap a scandalon, an offense. It's again the same Greek word, scandalon. There will be offense. It will come. An offense can either conceal or reveal, depending on our response to it. And any read-through of the New Testament, you'll notice Jesus frequently offended people on purpose. Not because he liked strife, nor because he wanted his way and his rights, but because Jesus knew of the potential for offense to sometimes reveal. So he took the risk of offense in certain correctly foreknown situations to cut open to the true problem underneath. But that cutting hurts. That offense is wounding. A surgeon and an assailant both use a knife, but one uses it carefully to heal, and the other to wound on purpose, with no intent for the other's well-being. In 4 quartets by T.S. Eliot, he builds on this metaphor of the healing wound of a surgeon. Quote, "The wounded surgeon plies the steel that questions the distempered part. Beneath the bleeding hands we feel the sharp compassion of the healer's art, resolving the enigma of the fever chart." And that phrase, the sharp compassion of the healer's art, is where I start my conversation with podcaster, pastor, and author Chase Replogle. But first, a little bit more about Chase. Chase Replogle is the pastor of Bent Oak Church in Springfield, Missouri. He's the author of The 5 Masculine Instincts and A Sharp Compassion. He holds a degree in Biblical Studies, an MA in New Testament from the Assemblies of God Theological Seminary, and he's a native of the Ozark Woods. He enjoys being outdoors with his wife and 2 kids, sailing, playing the mandolin badly, and quail hunting with his dog, Millie. Welcome, Chase Replogle. It's really exciting to have you here. I love your book, and it was one of my favorite top 5 reads of 2024 when that came out. So you chose the Greek phrase scandalon, and scandalon, or offense in Greek, originally meant a trap. But your book argues pretty conclusively from Scripture that Jesus regularly utilized scandalon in his teaching and offended on purpose. Why do you think this is?
Yeah, so there's quite a bit to dig into with this word because it's used in such a unique way, particularly in the Gospels. So if you do a little digging into the word, one of the things you'll find is that it's not particularly common, certainly not in this way, in Greek literature outside of the Bible, that it seems to be at least, somehow a theme that's being developed through the Old Testament, which we can get into if you're interested, and then is being used by Jesus and the gospel writers in particular around Jesus's conversations in a unique way. And part of the challenge of the word is, I don't think people realize how prominent this idea is in the Gospels, partly because it's a hard word to translate.
Yes.
As you mentioned, it's in its oldest Greek form. It has to do with a trap, or particularly the kind of bait, the baiting portion of a trap. Although I think it takes on unique meaning within the Jewish tradition of usage, but it's translated. I mean, the range of translation is really really broad. Everything from stumbling block to sin to hindrance to obstacle to the King James in the passage you just read uses offense,
Right.
all the way to I think there's one translation that'll sometimes translate it difficulties, right? Like an obstacle is a difficulty. So you can encounter this word over and over and over again and not actually recognize that it's this consistent word and it's actually a kind of unique concept. So I'm happy as much as you want to get into it, we can talk about how the idea developed, but it's a much more prominent theme than I think most people realize, particularly in the Gospels.
Yeah, you brought that out because of the range of translations. You don't see how often it comes up. And I didn't either until you mentioned that. And I went back into Scandalon, and obviously, most people are going to think of Scandalon as scandal. And scandal has a different connotation in our culture of juicy, gossipy tidbit. But the fact that it comes back to trap really is interesting in that I think it's sort of the way often in the Old Testament, it'll talk about God tempting or testing people. And this is sort of what Jesus is doing in the New Testament, and that word doesn't really get the right connotations because tempting and testing sounds masochistic, but that's not what God's doing. He's giving an opportunity. And I really feel like scandalon, you could almost see as an opportunity for offense, but not necessarily the guarantee of offense. You have this choice. And you have the choice to walk into the trap or not. And I find that's really interesting with testing, especially if you look at the Old Testament and how God tempts or tests the Israelites through the journey through the desert. He's essentially giving them an opportunity to see what he always sees. Well, you quote T.S. Eliot, the idea of a surgeon of I can see the problem, I need to cut at it to get to it. But a surgeon has to do it at the right time, the right place, with the right tools, and the right checklist. So God knows how to use offense. Sometimes we don't.
Yeah, I like to think of the way I like to think of the word is almost Jesus risking offense,
Yes,
because I think
yes.
that gets at the sort of, it really depends on our response to it. And in my experience, the way I got interested in this topic was reading through the conversations of Jesus and realizing Jesus was often saying things that actually offended people.
Yes.
Or he was saying things that we would not say because we would worry about offending people, and yet
Right.
people were not offended by it, and then would often be commended for great faith. And so, trying to understand how is he risking offense? How is he sort of stewarding difficult conversations, hard words, and recognizing that there was a kind of logic going on for Jesus in that he was willing to use these hard conversations, hard sayings to probe into something deeper within somebody than sometimes we're willing to. And we kind of have this view of Jesus. I think we like to make Jesus one of two things. Jesus is always affirmational. So he's always kind. He's always meek. He's always mild. He's always saying, polite, affirming things to people.
Look
He
upon
would
this little
never,
child, right?
yeah, that's right. He would never dare risk offending somebody. And that comes through often. I'm a pastor. So there's a temptation towards this in preaching to sort of always be affirmational. Or we look around and we see the culture we're living in sensitive to offense and shutting down a lot of hard conversations. And so there's a tendency to want to make Jesus always offensive, right? This sort of cursing brawler who's always picking fights and always pointing out, with hard words. Well, the truth is,
Provocateur, right?
that's right, a provocateur. That's a great word. The truth is, Jesus is actually doing both of these things in a much wiser way than sometimes we recognize. The way he's engaging conversations, he's risking offense for certain goals, not just to provoke offense. And the way that I put it in the book is, I think the reason this theme develops and is so important through the Bible is that offense can be a form of revelation.
Yes.
That what offends us, if we're willing to look at it, the experience of offense can actually draw our attention to things we've become blind to within ourselves. The feeling of offense can be a form of revelation for revealing what really matters to us, or the idols that matter to us. And so Jesus is using it, to use, the T.S. Eliot image. Jesus is using the risk of offense like a surgeon who's willing to sort of cut down in to expose the thing that's ill, right? The tumor that's inside,
Hmm.
for us to have this opportunity to see and remove that thing. And if not for a hard word, it's too easy for us to go on living in the blindness and ignoring that thing within us.
Yes, exactly. And I was just reading through Mere Christianity again, and C.S. Lewis's image of a scissors that really struck me. Again, going back to cutting instruments, but that you need both blades of a scissors. And when he's cutting, it's like, well, is God acting or is man acting? It's like, well, which blade do you want to focus in on? You need both. And the same thing with Jesus. He is both offending and he's also very gentle at the same time in different places, and his discernment of knowing when exactly to do it. Again, it goes to C.S. Eliot, the surgeon's art of knowing when, how, where, and not taking anything off the table. A time to wound, a time to heal, going back to Ecclesiastes. And you had mentioned tracing this theme through the Old Testament. I would really love to do that because I don't know the Septuagint really well, but where would they have translated the Old Testament scandalon? Like what Hebrew word? Do you know what they would do that there?
Yeah, it's not quite that clean. And I think
Oh,
what we're
okay.
dealing with, and this is why I think it's hard with translation sometimes, is we're dealing with a conceptual idea.
Right.
And the language around that idea can sometimes vary, but the idea itself is a Jewish thought that then is getting picked up in this kind of imaginative way by the gospel writers who are seeing it in Jesus. And
Right.
so I think when you see this picture through the Old Testament, you'll understand it's too big of an idea to be one word as well. It gets used narratively, it gets used sort of figuratively. And so the first place you'll notice in a lot of the English translations. So I pulled up a parallel passage here. So like the NIV has it, things that cause people to stumble, right?
Yes, stumbling is be a key word, and then I think tempting and
That's
stumbling
right.
and
But this idea of an obstacle you stumble over is often how it appears in the New Testament. That idea comes all the way back into Leviticus, where you get a very peculiar law that says that you should not place obstacles or stumbling blocks in the path of blind people.
right.
Which, if you
Yeah.
stop and think about it, is a weird thing to need a law for. Like, was this a problem in ancient Jewish society where people were tripping blind people, and we had to create a law in the Bible, right? Thou shalt not kill, thou
It
shalt
had
not commit
Jewish
adultery.
impractical jokers.
Yeah, that's right. And then in this list of laws is this don't trip blind people. So we're not the first ones to think that's strange. The
Right.
rabbinic writers, the Jewish writers, very far back had this question about this law. How do you interpret this law? And remember, they want to apply these laws to everyday life. And this is a strange one. I mean, how often in your life would you have needed to apply this law? So they began to interpret this law as a warning against taking advantage of a vulnerable person. So everything from predatory loan practices, you know that person's not going to be able to pay it back, but you make the loan anyways. You've taken advantage of their blindness. You place an obstacle in front of them. To, it'll be interpreted by some of the later rabbis as failing to mark tombs, lest a person wander over the tomb and unknowingly become unclean. So in other words, you've caused this person to fall. You've taken advantage of their blindness and caused them to fall. And so later on, this image then gets picked up by the prophets, and the prophets begin to use that image to describe the destruction that's brought about by idols.
Mm,
So when you begin to pursue an idol, the idol is promising you some goal, right? So it's
right.
a better harvest, or it's fertility, or it's victory in battle.
A means to an end, right?
Yeah, you're pursuing this idol with this promise, but what you don't realize is in your blindness, that idol will cause your destruction. It's promised you one thing, but it will trip you in your blindness, your sort of gullibility, and it will lead to your destruction. That's what the prophets keep trying to tell the people of Israel as they're
So
pursuing
that ties
idols.
to like the Greek scandalon of it's a trap,
That's
right?
right, exactly. So, yep. And this trap in this particular case is this obstacle in your path that blind to it will cause your fall. And that idea, too, is a little bit hard for us. We drive on paved roads and we walked on concrete sidewalks. And in the ancient world, as people were traveling long distances, if you stumbled and tripped and broke your ankle in the wilderness, that literally is a matter of life and death. You could die in the wilderness because of that's why you get in the Old Testament these images of like making straight the paths, right, of righteousness. It's
Right.
this idea that the walk, the journey would be smooth and safe and easy because tripping and stumbling is more dangerous than sometimes we think about it.
Well, like
So
the equivalent would be, I guess, flat tire in Death Valley. Unless you have AAA,
yeah, that's
you're
exactly
out of
right.
luck
Yeah, this is a
up a
dangerous
creek.
situation. Yep.
Right.
So that idea is primarily connected to idols, the lie of idols, the blindness of our pursuit of idols. But then Isaiah picks it up in a very unexpected way and begins to describe that God himself will make himself an obstacle for stumbling,
Hmm.
a stone of stumbling for his people. And it seems to be taking the same idea and saying, what does God do with this people who continues to chase after in their blindness idols? How can God rescue a people that's constantly running towards the idols of their neighbors? And the idea Isaiah picks up is, and this obviously gets connected to what happens with the exiles, but God will cause the fall, the stumbling of his people to save them from the coming destruction of their idols. It's as if they're running towards a cliff. And the gracious thing is, God is going to trip them and break them before they run off the cliff, before they're ultimately destroyed. So Isaiah all of a sudden picks up this image and says, God himself will become a stumbling block to his people to save them from their idols. Again, keeping it connected to blindness, because that's the original image, this is the challenge, right? We are blind to the things we're pursuing and the
Right.
destruction that they will cause. And how does a gracious God force us to see the thing that we're refusing to see?
Right.
That, I think, is what Jesus and then the New Testament gospel writers pick up and recognize. And it starts to make sense out of what Jesus is saying in these passages. Obstacles will come, right? There will
Hmm.
be opportunities for stumbling and falling,
Right.
but do not be the person who becomes the obstacle, right?
Right.
So he's picking up on that Old Testament idea all the way back to Leviticus. But then Jesus will do two things with this. He will often become the obstacle. He will
Hmm.
risk offense, stumbling, to help a person to see what they're blind to. But then I think one of the great passages to look at is when Peter begins to pull Jesus aside and rebuke Jesus, saying, "You will not suffer. Stop speaking of suffering." And Jesus says to him, "Get behind me, Satan. You've become," we often translate it, "an obstacle to me." But it's that same word, scandalon. You've become a scandal to me, an offense to me, a stumbling block to me. And I actually think this makes visually a lot of sense too, because Peter no longer is following Jesus, but he's pulled Jesus to the side and he's placed himself and his logic in the path of Jesus towards the cross, this temptation. And he's risking Jesus stumbling over this possibility, this temptation that there's another way. And so Jesus will use this language. You've become an obstacle to me, right?
Right. Because he's
So,
blocking the path that, talking about straight paths. And also, it's interesting we get from these idea of woe to those who bring the offense, but Jesus is bringing the offense. And that's sort of, again, God is allowed to offend. God is offending, creating stumbling blocks because he has clear vision. He's not blind. And that it's almost like our prohibition against judgment of you always have to judge and you always have to offend, but there is a wariness to it of you have to do it very carefully. It's almost like vengeance of like certain people are put in rulership positions or leadership positions and they have to take prohibitive disciplinary measures, but that is a very serious thing. Sort of like it's a very serious thing to offend, but you have to do it sometimes. But it is God who takes vengeance, God who takes the offense, God who takes the right. So Jesus has the right to offend anyone he pleases all the time because his vision is clear. And
yes.
so I think that ties into this idea of to correct your brother, you're going to offend him. And so, but before you correct your brother, make sure your vision is clear. Take the log out of your own eye so that you can offend them rightly.
Yeah, that's exactly right. He's not saying don't ever offend your brother.
Right.
He's saying be sure that you see clearly so
Right.
that you can, because this is what Jesus is able to do. Jesus is the one who sees and perceives into the heart, right? This is that
Right.
image again of the sword that pierces all the way in. He
Right.
sees the things in us that we tend to ignore and be blind to. And that's what allows him to risk the potential of offense. And when you see this and you start looking at the conversations Jesus is having in the Gospels, you'll see this over and over and over. That people come to Jesus expecting one conversation or
Right.
even having practice, like rehearsed how this conversation is
Like
going
the
to
rich
go.
young ruler. Yeah.
That's exactly. And Jesus will find ways to instead subvert that conversation and
Right.
drive a different point into the conversation. And then it becomes a moment of decision. Jesus has placed an obstacle in front of that person, a potential offense, and they will have to decide, do they overcome it by faith and see that obstacle, or do they trip over it to their own offense and destruction? And what's so great about that scene with Peter is Peter is the one that in such a great way in his epistles puts this all together, because Peter will go back to the Isaiah passage and he will
Right.
say
And
that
Paul too. Yeah.
the stone that causes stumbling and offense has now become the cornerstone, right? So,
Right.
in other words, those who are willing to see what Jesus is pointing out no longer stumble over or are offended by what he's saying, but instead begin to build their lives into this new structure with Christ being that stone of stumbling, now the cornerstone of a new building.
I love how Peter builds the whole metaphor slowly because he's the rock. Peter means rock,
That's
and he's
right.
talking about living stones. I have a previous episode on that, but these are all together in this like these living stones, and I'm the big stone, and you're the little stone, and Jesus is the rock, and we are all potential stumbling stones. So he's pulling it back to, I know Paul at a certain point uses the same citation from Isaiah, right?
Yes, that's right. Yep. Yeah. And this is why I think this is more than just a word. A lot of this lives behind the word scandalon, but we really
Right.
have this sort of image within, I think, the Jewish way of thinking. We have this sort of conceptual, sort of almost story of stumbling and blindness and
Right.
fall that they're all riffing off of in these stories, even sometimes where scandalon isn't used specifically, but all of this sort of lives behind the word scandalon that often gets.
Well, yeah, exactly, like correcting your brother and the idea of a log in your eye. I think the word scandalon isn't there, but the idea of offense is, and I think it's, yeah, you could have put it there very easily. It just doesn't happen to be in the text, but the idea is all throughout the New
Yep.
Testament. And I think I like that idea of you're connecting it to the Old Testament of tripping and idols. But again, this is the same God, Yahweh, who is leading the Israelites through the desert, and he's right there. And he's essentially, you said, he gives opportunities, or what do you say, risking offense. And same thing within the journey through the desert. God is risking offense with the people of like 3 days of no water. That's risking offense, but he's trying to give them an opportunity to pull out an issue he sees in them. He's essentially the journey towards the promised land is dangerous in that God sees all the issues that can arise. He's got clear vision, and each stop along the way, he's trying to take an offense and give them an opportunity to clear up that future problem. And you even see that it's an interesting theme that comes through the Old Testament. Journeys towards your promised location are opportunities for offense of, here's a unstraight way. When Moses is walking towards, he's just been called to Pharaoh. He's supposed to go to Pharaoh, and God stops him along the way and is going to kill him. And that's a really weird story, but it is actually the same thing that happens to Israel of they're going on where they're promised to go to, and God is stopping them and trying to take out a potential problem. Because you see Moses before he's opposing God, he's worried, he's hemming and hawing, but once he gets to Pharaoh, he's a different person. So something along the way, God had to deal with him on the journey, cause an offense with him and his wife. There's something about his wife not willing to, there's something about maybe a cultural practice. I've seen a lot of rabbis on it, but like, I don't want to circumcise these boys. It's like, Moses is going to go to Pharaoh to represent the entire nation while being in direct rebellion, and he's saved by blood. So it's almost like he gets pre-Passover. He is smeared with the blood. The blood protects him from the avenging angel, so prepares him to be the leader that needs to do this exact same thing to Pharaoh. But it's basically God gives him a real big opportunity for offense, and he passes it. And his wife passes it. Of this is a test to pull out. There is a real strong root of disobedience in him. When he sees the burning bush, his first instinct is, wow. And his second instinct is, no, I don't want to. But by the time he's there, he doesn't have that instinct anymore. At least it's much weaker. So the offense, God did an emergency surgery on the road. So you see that all over the place. But I think that's a really amazing that you can pull in the tripping and the blindness. Because I'm thinking of John, right? John 8, where he's talking to the Pharisees about their blindness. And I think in his mind, and I'm sure in their mind, when you pull up blindness, you have that Levitical law of you're putting stumbling blocks in the way of other people. Now, are you blind or are you not? Because the way he treats them varies because they say, we're not blind. And that arrogance and that pride is like, okay, well, you are clearly putting stumbling blocks in the way of other people. That's what he says to them. And if you're not blind, then I'm free to offend you. Because if you're not blind, then I would have treated you differently. But your arrogance and insisting you're not blind, I think they're both thinking of the Levitical law in the background there. And I think that's something that's so great about learning Leviticus. In the background of all these conversations with Jesus, he's always thinking of various passages that, unless you're thinking of them the same way, you may read his words wrong.
Yeah, I had a great Hebrew professor who used to say that the New Testament is a scripture bound society. And what he meant by that
Yes.
was the words they use, the images they imagine, the way that conversation functions. It's so infused with the Old Testament scripture that it's the language, the categories, the shape. It's always in one way or another coming back to these images from the Old Testament. It's the world that they sort of grew up in. And I think Moses is a really fascinating example to bring up because I do think what we're getting at is the way in which offense can be a form of revelation. That's kind of where we
Yes.
started. That if you will have one of two outcomes, right? When somebody says something hard to you, and this is what's so destructive about offense. When somebody says something hard to you, if you are offended by it, the experience of offense tends to draw the attention away from ourselves and onto that other person.
Correct.
We fixate on the thing they've done to us. So it actually hardens our blindness. It gives us a way of not having to look at ourselves. But if in a moment of a hard word being spoken to us, we see the thing that it reveals in us, or we ask, why did this particular thing offend me? Then it becomes a form of revelation to what's actually motivating us within us. It reveals things to us.
Correct.
I think the other really key passage, maybe two of them to add to this, is there. I talk in the book about offense being a form of stewardship for Christians. We get at that with the removing the speck from our own eye before the log of the brothers.
Yeah.
But how do we, because at the end of the day, the New Testament tells us that the gospel is an offense. We know that in proclaiming Jesus, people will be offended. So what does that look like? Well, let's come back to those two kind of models of offense, right? I offend nobody or I offend everyone to prove the point. Well, there has to be a deeper logic to when we're willing to risk hard conversations, the truth of the gospel. And Jesus gives us a little bit of that. So there's that great story where Peter is so often at the center of these stories, partly because Peter gets it wrong over and over, and Jesus is constantly correcting him. And one of the things I love about Peter is he just keeps showing back up.
Yeah.
He's not offended. He takes these corrections in stride. And so there's this great scene where they're in Capernaum and the tax collector comes and asks Peter if Jesus is going to pay the temple tax. It's not a legally required from the Torah. It's not required, but it's a tradition that arose to help support the temple and the priesthood. And so males of a certain age were supposed to pay it. Apparently Jesus hadn't yet. So Peter very quickly says, to save face, oh, absolutely, he's going to pay it. So Peter comes back to Jesus and says, hey, are we going to pay the temple tax? And it seems like it's set up as another correction of Peter's story, because Jesus begins to push back. He says, should the son of the prince, the son of the palace, have to pay for the palace? Like, is it my responsibility to raise funds for my father's house? And you think Peter spoke too soon, which is always the Peter problem, right? He's agreed to something.
Yes.
But then Jesus says, lest we offend him, the tax collector, go and catch a fish and open his mouth, and inside you'll find the coin, and go pay the tax for both of us. And you get this idea of scandalon again. I thought that was so fascinating. Here's Jesus so willing to risk offense
In certain areas.
but in this particular story,
not
in
always.
this particular
Right.
story, unwilling to risk offense. And I think it has to do with, if Jesus had offended the tax collector, if he had refused to pay out of who he is, Jesus would have been defending his own rights. He would have been defending his own position, but it would have served to reveal nothing about this tax collector in his heart.
Mhm.
Nothing in this conversation was ultimately about, I mean, this tax collector was just doing the job that was asked of him. So Jesus seems reluctant to offend, to protect himself, or to make a point about himself. He's only willing to risk offense when it reveals something within the heart of the person that they're blind to, that he's in conversation with. And the ultimate picture of this, I think, is Christ himself. Christ is the one who is constantly without offense. Christ is the one that, hanging on the cross, as they mock and revile him, instead of being offended, will say, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. That ultimately the person who sees all things, right? The person who is, I write in the book a lot about insecurity, who's not insecure to the things that work within them, is actually a person who does not take offense. And I think it's a kind of model for us as well too, right? That the way out of offense is like Christ, to be able to hear all things, to consider all things, to be humble enough to not need to respond to those things. And then out of that, we sort of find ourselves in this place like Christ, of being able to overcome offense and see and hear through the truth of it. And then because of that, better than at stewarding offense ourselves, and knowing when a hard word is just about us getting even, us defending ourselves, us making a point, versus revealing.
Right. The idea of revenge and offense do seem to come together, because, like you said, offend is like, what was it? The old French offendre, which is to strike. There's something about offensiveness and vengeance that do go together. And there is a time for judgment and a time for correct offense. But a lot of times, offense is simply about revenge. And I like this idea. You keep on bringing it back to, and toying with this as you're talking. As like, this is really interesting. Jesus has the clearest vision, so he is not offended. The more you can see, the less offended you get. And that's the same logic he gives from the cross of, they're blind. They don't see what they're doing. I am forgiving them. I am not offended. I see, they don't see, because they're blind and they don't see what they're doing. So I'm not offended by their blindness. Yeah, so that's a really interesting thing that you're pulling out. And swinging back to Moses, as I was talking, I'm thinking as I'm talking, he's walking towards Pharaoh, who he's going to greatly offend. And he's going to bring offense against a very powerful person on God's orders and in God's way. And he's giving him 10 offenses, basically, 10 deep, powerful offenses. And God Again, that's the two scissors that C.S. Lewis talks about. God is giving him a chance, a revelation, a chance to see. And at sometimes it says God hardened his heart, and sometimes it says he hardened his heart, because I think it's both sides of the scissors. They both happened. God is giving him he's cutting into the real truth here, and Pharaoh is focusing on Moses of how dare you do this to me. And he's offended each time by Moses's words, but they're not coming from Moses, they're coming from God. So God is giving him 10 offenses and 10 plagues that are like, and the offenses grow in offensiveness to the point where he actually deeply offends him by taking away his future and his heir, which is also something striking I never realized until some commentary brought out. He's clearly not the firstborn son, otherwise he would have died. So he is offended, and he's already in a place of insecurity of, I'm not the firstborn son, I really shouldn't be on this throne. So I'm already shaky. So his firstborn son then dies of like, that is the deepest offense.
Yeah, and there's certainly something going on with the darkness of it too, right?
Yeah.
Because this happens while he's asleep at night, so it is a kind of blindness that's taking place in that story as well too.
Right.
He does not see this offense, right? This loss that's coming to him until it's occurred. So
Right.
there is a kind of blindness, and part of what the Passover is an awareness of what's coming, right? That even
Right.
through the night, as they eat of this meal, they sort of see and understand what is breaking before them. They're not blind to what the death that is sort of passing through the cities.
Right. And I think I've got to go back to that Moses passage, but as he's on the way, that happens at night too, right? The Lord comes to him and would strike him dead, which is, again, he's giving him the same treatment as Pharaoh. He's preparing him for
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Passover, and he's preparing him for the final plague of, you have to be covered under the blood. Otherwise, the offense you're about to wield is a powerful sword. You have to be able to hold it.
Yeah, this is one of the big points I try to make in the book, because I realized, writing a book about how Jesus is offensive can be
Right.
licensed for people to say like, oh, well, therefore we need to go be offensive. And I
Right.
do think there's an element of truth to that. I mean, we can get into that if you want. We live in a moment where people are so sensitive to offense that I do worry we're losing some of the direct offense of the gospel.
And I definitely 100% believe that. But I think sometimes we see that, we know that, and so we overcorrect. And the idea of overcorrecting and pushing back too hard rather than looking to God and simply I guess the idea is always to let God offend. I was thinking of the idea of Samuel
Mhm.
and Eli needs offense. Eli is offensive to God. Eli's sons, the heirs, are violating so many laws of what they're doing. And Samuel is not offending them. Samuel is sort of sitting under authority of them until God gives the offensive word. And then he's a little intimidated, but God has to be the offender. God has the right to offend. And what's that thing from Ezekiel? If you get the warning and you don't pass on the warning, then that falls on your head. And you have to be willing to offend when God is willing to offend.
Yeah, and the
But
point
yeah,
I make in the book is the person who's best prepared to steward offense is a person who has themselves overcome offense.
right.
So if you find yourself easily offended, you're the last person that should be risking offense. That the
Right.
person who
Yeah.
is prepared to risk the offense of the gospel in wise, discerning ways is the person themselves who has encountered offenses and has come out on the side of faith instead of being offended. And you do get that. I mean, I think your example with Moses is really fascinating. I'm gonna have to go back and look more at it. But anywhere God calls a person to be sort of vocal for him, there's always a sense of personal loss, or there's always a sense of humility that is forced into that person's life. Their lives are always complicated. They're always in the midst of barrenness. They're always in the midst of some form of suffering, Christ himself. Because unless we're able to overcome offense, we're really not in a position to be able to steward offense. And that's one of the things I hope really comes through in the book as well, too, is that, the wisest, let's come back to your image, the one who has seen the log in his own eye is the one that's most prepared to remove speck. You have to be able to experience the revelation of offense and overcome it before you're prepared to sort of take the stage and start wielding that sort of offense.
Right. You have to have had surgery on you
Yep.
before you can be a proper surgeon, which is not exactly the image of T.S. Eliot, but that's a good image.
Yep.
All right. Well, I like to end my interviews with 4 quick questions. So this one may not be a quick question because I've heard your podcast on your favorite books of each year, and you do a great job highlighting one. So how about a recent favorite book?
Uh, a recent favorite book. Oh man, I'm always reading a lot. Let me Well, let's do this. If you're interested in what we've been talking about today, I actually pulled it off the shelf. There's a great little monograph called "The Scandal of the Gospels." It's by
Hmm.
David McCracken, and he gets into this. A lot of my sort of initial understandings of the theme of scandalon came from this book, so I would highly recommend this.
David
The
McCracken.
Scandal
Okay.
of the Gospels by McCracken. It's a good book
Great.
recommendation for this conversation.
And your favorite movie?
Oh man, two. I love Gettysburg, the Civil War movie. I went through
Oh
a
yeah,
phase in
yeah.
childhood where I was sort of obsessed with the Civil War, exposing a lot of my nerdiness. Or I love the movie Master and Commander. My wife and I
Oh,
like to
that's a really
sail.
good one. Yeah.
I'm super into boats, ships, so I love that movie as well.
Yeah, research based. So you like the research based
Long
movies?
historical movies. Yeah, there seems to be a theme
Yeah.
there, huh?
And your favorite tree?
Oh, my favorite tree. We have right outside my window. I've got two apple trees out there, and that is one of my
Mhm.
favorite. There's always deer in them, or my daughter climbing them and picking apples. So I love those particular apple trees we have.
Awesome. And your favorite spot, which can be either like a city
Hmm.
or a region or an area?
Over the last few years, my wife and I have fallen in love with France. We support missionaries there. We've been several
Okay.
times. God's really doing some interesting things with young people in France right now, and we particularly love the region of Normandy. I love Paris, but Normandy. I'm obsessed enough. I've been trying to learn a little French so I can at least order in French and kind of get around.
Hmm.
But man, a cafe in France with some good food and a cup of coffee is hard to beat. That's where if you could put me anywhere right now, that's probably where it would
You
be.
had said when you like to travel, you like to research it, and that's part of your fun. And I totally agree with that because there are so many places I would like to go now, but I do a lot of historical research through podcasts.
Mm-hmm.
There's a great one on Norman history,
Oh, I'd
which,
like to hear it.
but
Yeah.
such a different region because of all the Vikings that came
Yes,
in.
yeah.
It has such a different
Back and
history.
forth between
It's
the
kind of
British
half
and the
English, half
French. That's
Viking.
right. Yep.
Right. Yeah. So, well, that's awesome. Well, thank you very much. And I appreciate your time spent here with us. And we'll all learn how to be less offended and let God do the offense.
Yeah, and thanks for such a great conversation. So it's where I get to dive this deep into Greek words and biblical
It's
history,
fun.
and I really appreciate a good conversation like this.
Yeah, I like to nerd out too. So this is awesome. Fellow nerds unite. Thank you again, Chase. That was a great interview. Hope to have you on again. And as always, I hope you will join me again on the next episode and beyond. In the meantime, go dig a little bit deeper into the Word, and remember, in Christ, in Him, the Lord has set us free and put our feet into a broad and spacious place. Bammerhab, a huge word just waiting to be explored. So let's go exploring. So let's go exploring. So let's go exploring. If you like what you heard and you get a chance, please rate, like, and subscribe, or share this episode with your friends. For more information about Bammerhab, go to www.sdgmorgan.com or visit the Bammerhab Substack page. A special thanks to my friend Aaron Woodard for the graphic design of the show. Also, don't forget to check out this episode's show notes below.